And so he's pretty well known. By the same token, in 1945, Intrepid had another air group on board, Air Group 10, and their fighter squadron, nicknamed the Grim Reapers, are really well represented in literature, all from 1942 all the way to the end of the war, and now at the museum as part of a new exhibition, which opened in March of 2025. They again have pretty good representation in the form of this Corsair fighter aircraft, which is painted in their colors. This was the plane that was flown by, or is painted to look like a plane flown by Alfred Lurch, who shot down 7 enemy aircraft in one day during a very large kamikaze attack against Intrepid in April 1945. But there's a gap here between early 1944 and 1945 that includes some of the largest naval battles, some of the largest air battles that took place in the Pacific. And the men who were aboard Intrepid at that time were part of Air Group 18 and Fighting 18, which I became interested in and wrote my book about. They were not particularly well represented in the literature, either online or in print or even at the museum. And that got me interested in why that might have been the case. Like I said, they were aboard during these climactic battles of 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when General MacArthur returned to the Philippines. The squadron produced a number of aces, including the man at right here, Roy Burnett. The guys called him Bud. And also the Navy's second highest scoring ace of World War II, who's pictured at left in this photograph, Cecil Speedball Harris from South Dakota. That was a nickname given to him for his softball pitches, actually, when they were training in Hawaii. He was a quiet school teacher and farm boy from South Dakota who really eschewed the spotlight. He was kind of uncomfortable with being thought of as a hero. He knew being a fighter pilot was part of teamwork. You had a division that you flew with, you had a wingman watching your back, and you couldn't be successful unless you were working effectively as part of a team. So he really, by dodging the spotlight, subsequently kind of dodged the historical record and interest from historians down the line. But he was recommended for the Medal of Honor. He shot down 24 enemy aircraft, most of them in the span of about 3 months. And he's been referred to as arguably the most consistently exceptional fighter pilot in the US Navy during World War II. And of course, that means throughout the course of Navy history. In Harris's honor and memory and spirit, I thought if I'm going to write about him and write about his unit, I should try to find out more about the men that he served with. And that's what led to this book, which was rather unexpected. This is my first published work. But once I got speaking with the families, I felt it was kind of incumbent on me to put all the stories together in one place. So one of the stories that I started with, and one of the families I first reached out to during COVID, when we were all trapped in our houses and had nowhere to go, and it was very easy to get people on the phone if you are not selling them something or you're not a robot spam calling. I had the opportunity to reach out to the Keels family. This is Wesley Keels, pictured at right. He actually grew up in a sharecropping family. He was one of 9 children. He was the eldest in the family. He grew up picking soy and cotton. And he actually was able to work to pay for a 2-year college program, took civilian pilot training, and that helped him transition into the Navy, which was a very proud moment for him. A lot of his items, his artifacts, are now in the collection of the Intrepid Museum, thanks to the Keels family, including the flight training notebook you see in the center here. And I know that he was quite proud to become a naval aviator because from his humble beginnings, he invested a lot of what he had saved and maybe his first officer's paycheck to get a very nice set of wings of gold, his naval aviator's wings, which you see in the bottom left corner here. When you flip them over, you can see a really nice snowflake print. These were a higher end kind of design, and so you know he wore them with pride. I used him as a cipher for the book to understand what ground training was like for these men. You know, before you can fly, you have to understand the physics of flight. For example, that's the left-hand page. This is all of his hand, circa March 1942. You have to know what kind of ships you might be going up against. You have to know the rules and regulations of serving in the Navy. If you're coming from a landlocked, if you're coming from the mountains, basically, you're not going to have experience with port and starboard and all of this Navy jargon. So he had to learn on the fly, and it was very interesting to see what his takeaways were, what he underlined, and to get a sense of who he was through what he wrote down. By the same token, learning about what actual flight training was like, I was able to get in touch with the son of Bryant Leonidas Walworth, who's pictured here. His son Lee interviewed his father extensively and kept quite a few of his military service documents. So I was able to see, for example, his yearbook. That's the flight jacket there in the center. And I was also able to see his diary that he received for Christmas 1942 from his sister, and his operational training records, which are like scorecards almost, after you earn your wings and you're actually in a unit flying aircraft similar to the kind you'll fly in combat. So I got to learn a lot about him, writing in his diary, thinking maybe he's not going to pass the next check flight, and how elated he was when he actually did move on to the next stage of training, and how dangerous training could be as well. By the time he reached operational training, that's the unit at the left here, it's 1943. These guys are getting ready to transition from the East Coast to the West Coast, getting closer to the war in the Pacific. That's the theater these men operated in. And this is the time where Wally, which is what the guys called him, he's kneeling front right in this image, began to meet members of the future Fighting Squadron 18. Two of the guys standing in the back, second and third from left, are Franklin Burley, Cecil Harris's wingman, and Paul Ammerman, who the guys called Boot, or Boot Nose Ammerman. So at this point, things are getting very dangerous. Actually, over the course of my research, I learned something I thought was really fascinating, which is that training, deaths in training and operational deaths in operational accidents outnumber deaths in combat over the course of the war in the Pacific. So being a naval aviator is extremely dangerous before the shooting starts, before you're even flying against enemy targets. That actually continued through the course of Fighting 18's training. The men went to the West Coast and then Hawaii in November 1943. And some of the members of the squadron who were temporarily deployed to help the Navy's offensive across the Central Pacific didn't make it to Intrepid, their future ship. That was the case for Sidney Wells McGurk, who's at the left here. And this is Fighting Squadron 36 at the right. So this is the squadron that will become the squadron that I subsequently wrote about. He was killed in an operational accident returning to the ship Essex. And I was in touch with his niece and able to see some of the letters that were sent to and from the family, talking about what this loss meant to them personally, how close he was to his father. His father, actually a very successful insurance man from Indiana, commissioned a number of pieces of art in honor of his son, and that's what you're seeing in the center here. This is from the Indiana Historical Society, a bust in honor of his son who was killed in February 1944. So as you can imagine, learning all of this and making these connections got me extremely emotionally invested in the subject matter. Now, after this early February 1944 push, the men returned from temporary duty. It was less than a month out on these various ships across the fleet. Were in Hawaii and began to develop an identity as a squadron. They changed the squadron's designation, the Navy did, from Fighting 36 to Fighting 18. They needed a carrier squadron at this point because increasingly the offensive was moving at a rapid pace through the Central Pacific towards the Philippines. And these men were in the right place at the right time to get folded into a carrier unit. This is a big upgrade from maybe eating canned rations, sleeping in a tent, dealing with anti-malarial mosquito nets, to serving on an Essex-class carrier, the kind of cutting edge for the Navy at this point. And the men are training all through summer of 1944, developing this identity. You'll see on the right, it says the Hellions. I've seen a number of different names associated with the squadron early in their deployment, including for this insignia, the fickle finger or the sainted devil, kind of the grinning demon there with a halo over his head. And there is kind of a devil-may-care attitude, you know, at this point in summer of 1944, as the men have long, hot months waiting to finally deploy aboard Intrepid. They're getting to visit local haunts. They're getting to go on ranches and rodeos to blow off steam. They're getting to go swimming at the bachelor's officers' quarters, and they're getting to experience all of these kind of great distractions Hawaii has to offer. And actually, they wind up there longer than expected and become frustrated, frankly, that they're not being deployed. The problem was that Intrepid, which is at the right here, had been torpedoed in February of 1944, and repairs were taking a very, very long time, longer than the Navy anticipated. And so by the end of June 1944, when the squadron thought they would already be deployed, the leader of their air groups were consisting of 3 squadrons, a dive bomber, torpedo, and a fighter squadron for a ship like this. The leader of the air group had to issue a memorandum to all hands telling them basically to wait, to hurry up and wait. This is going to be your experience in the military. It's bigger than you are, and it will do you well for your peace of mind and your experience to train as best you can, to not let it bother you, and to be ready for what's coming, because it's going to be more maybe than you can anticipate. And then sure enough, by August 1944, Intrepid is finally ready, and the guys have their opportunity to go out and experience firsthand what they've been training for over a year and a half by this point. This photo is of Intrepid in the fall of 1944, and actually has some of the planes from Air Group 18 aboard ship, and I'll talk about how we know that a little bit later. I do want to point out at this time that the men in Fighting Squadron 18, although they've been training for an extended period of time, the higher ranked men in the squadron have hundreds, if not thousands of hours of flight training by this point. Almost none of them have seen combat yet. Only Cecil Harris has really seen a serious dust-up with Japanese aircraft. That was in April of 1943 over the Solomons. The rest of the squadron, you know, is quote-unquote green. They're guys who have a lot of flight experience, but they've never fired at an enemy aircraft. They've never had to dive through anti-aircraft fire or anything like that. And the reason I point that out is because they're going aboard a ship, Intrepid, which, although it has picked up a reputation for bad luck at this time, being torpedoed within a few weeks of actually going and fighting the enemy, being damaged transiting the Panama Canal, actually not being damaged by the enemy, just by an accident before it can even see action. Even though they're going aboard a ship that has kind of a reputation as a jinxed ship, the men aboard that ship, the crew, are very proud of their service to date because they've actually gone and fought. Some of them have been killed in action already from that torpedo and from just the circumstances of prosecuting a war. They were able to get their ship safely back to Hawaii and then back to San Francisco for repairs. And so they've already seen combat. So they're not sure, you know, this new air group, how they're going to perform, if they have what it takes. There's still a little bit of a gap between the air group and the ship's company. And that's not going to be corrected until they actually go out and fight and see what each other are made of. But it's very important to note that because they have to work together regardless of this divide. This is an aircraft from Air Group 18. They, at this point of the war, marked aircraft with special tail signs to be able to tell which ship the air group belonged to. So that equilateral cross on the tail there says this is an Air Group 18 plane. This plane belongs at this point for this deployment to Intrepid. The men there are ship's company. They're moving it to an aircraft elevator to get it up to the flight deck. Intrepid had 3 big elevators to move planes up to the wooden flight deck. That's teak over pine for launch. Many of these piston power aircraft would just do a deck run. They would get the engine going and then take off into the wind with the ship cruising upwards of 20 miles an hour, generating lift, wind over the deck, and then they would take off for their mission. There were also, I should say, hydraulic catapults aboard a ship like this. You can see the track of the aircraft being launched on the right-hand side, the starboard side of the ship, and the number 11 on the front of the ship indicates Intrepid. It's CV-11, the 3rd Essex-class carrier that was commissioned. And then, of course, besides helping to launch your aircraft. The ship's crew were responsible for getting you safely aboard, probably, the most important part of the equation. A landing signal officer would be on the back of a ship like Intrepid with paddles. As you see here, this is Richard Moot. He was the guy responsible for landing aircraft aboard Intrepid for a number of years. And you would really rely on him to tell you if you could land aboard ship. Frankly, if he told you no, you would get in a lot of trouble if you came back to Intrepid. You would really want to circle as long as he told you to until it was safe to come back aboard. And the best experience of this that I have for fighting Squadron 18 actually comes from an artist who was aboard ship and part of the squadron. His name's Ed Ritter. He was an advertising artist who went to Pratt Institute from Brooklyn, and he produced a number of watercolors about his and the squadron's experience, how stressful it was trying to take off. Everyone is giving you all of this information. You have to remember. You're rubbernecking, looking at all of their chalkboards, trying to figure out where the ship's going to be at the end of your mission so that you can get back home safely. When you're coming back to the ship, maybe it's under attack, maybe you're not recognized correctly. The anti-aircraft batteries aboard these ships open up, and now friendly forces are shooting at you. This is sort of a comical rendering of that of a Snipo, as he was called in the squadron, Edgar Blankenship, waving an American flag, trying to say, I'm with you guys. I'm not trying to attack you. And then, of course, coming back aboard ship, you would never do this, obviously. Look ma, no hands kind of an action. And then being happy that you've actually survived your first strike. This is called Zumi's first strike. He's bending double and kissing the flight deck. I would not recommend that, whether the ship's in service or a museum ship. But elated nonetheless to have made it back in one piece. You can see actually the piece that Ed Ritter is working on in the press photo on the left is the image on the right. So I was able to find this press photograph, which appeared in a Brooklyn newspaper, and donate the original to the museum. It's amazing what you can find on eBay. Now, in terms of what the squadron was experiencing at this point, this is a map of the Pacific during World War II. That red line is the furthest advance of the Japanese over the course of the war. And by 1944, the fall of 1944, when these guys are aboard Intrepid, they're about here, where the anchor is. This is the Marshall Islands, Eniwetok Fleet Anchorage, and they're launching strikes way far away. You can probably see in the top left corner, that's 1,600 miles is that sort of 1 inch distance. They're thousands of miles away from the targets they're striking. So logistically, this is very challenging, and they're not going to be able to stay out for long without needing replenishment, some rest. It's not a great way to have to prosecute the war, but that'll change the following month. Now, at this time, September 1944, strikes on the Palau Islands. You might be familiar with names like Peleliu. It was a big Marine Corps invasion. And then in the Philippines, Mindanao, the large southern island, and then the Visayas, the central Philippines. At this point, the men in the squadron are going out on missions. They're coming back, and they're saying to themselves, where are these Japanese aircraft we've been promised? Where is the enemy? We're not being intercepted. There are no enemy planes rising to fight us. In fact, Admiral Halsey, commander of the Third Fleet, goes so far as to say that it's unbelievable and fantastic that this close to the Japanese kind of inner defensive perimeter, they're not exhibiting any kind of pushback. The biggest threat for the men of Fighting Squadron 18 at this point in September 1944 is anti-aircraft fire. And indeed, the first handful of men from the squadron who are lost are killed as a result of anti-aircraft fire. That's what the action report on the right-hand side shows. There's just one name down in the middle of the document. It's William Sartwell. He was a young man from Texas, from a cattle ranching family. He was lost to anti-aircraft fire. But this is a presentation about artifacts and the research behind the squadron. There's another name on this action report, another plane, I should say, at the top of the action report that did come back. And there's a big paragraph about what this plane experienced. It had a 1-foot hole blown through the fuselage. The body of the aircraft had almost all of the control cables severed. But there's no indication through any of the pages of this report what pilot was flying that plane. The Navy and the military in general would not be interested in that sort of information. The pilot came back. They know that. That's great. Is not injured, can continue flying. all they need to know, the higher ups at least, is that the plane needs to be repaired and what specifically about the aircraft needs to be replaced. That's the interesting information from a military standpoint. From my standpoint as a historian, obviously, I want to know who was in that plane and what they experienced, and if we know more about how they felt about that. And that's where logbooks, like the kind you see in the box to the left, come into play, because that's one of the only sources of information from the point of view of the guy flying that mission. It will contain a lot more information than you'll find on the action report from an individual kind of personal level. And indeed, in the course of reaching out to these families, I was able to identify that pilot as Wally Walworth, a guy we've met before earlier in the presentation. In September of 44, his September 24th logbook entry, he lists hit 20 millimeter shell, strike over Negros and Panay Islands. Those are in the Visayas. And indeed, in the course of watching videos of Lee Walworth interview his father, he mentions this specific incident, basically not knowing how badly his aircraft had been damaged. The guys flying with him would not tell him. They didn't want to freak him out, on the way back to Intrepid. And then how important it was for the landing signal officer to give him a cut to tell him you can bring your plane safely back to ship, because he probably wouldn't have made a whole lot of passes despite his trouble handling his aircraft. So that was a big moment early in the research from my book that kept me going and kind of lit the flame to finish this project. The other big part of the experience of these men in September was photo reconnaissance. And because fighter pilots, the Hollywood stereotype and all of the stories are about air battle, one-on-one, duking it out, all of this stuff, aerial reconnaissance gets short shrift. It's a little less sexy than air combat. But for me, there's nothing cooler than being able to open a can of aerial reconnaissance footage from one of these aircraft from 1944 and to be able to actually handle it and say, this was in this guy's plane flying over the Philippines in 1944. So the lead photographic officer in the squadron is pictured at left. That's Harvey Picken. The guys called him Pick. That's how most of the nicknames worked. And I went down to National Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland, and was able to unroll all of these negatives and get a sense of where they were circa mid-September 1944. They were providing information to Admiral Halsey, to some of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, ultimately, who were looking at information like this at the Octagon Conference in Quebec, to be able to figure out what the next step would be. And actually their research helped play a role in advancing the timetable for the invasion of the Philippines. A lot of Navy squadrons at that time were contributing evidence that there was a kind of weak position on Leyte, and we need to strike sooner than later. This negative was in the rolls of film that I handled. And again, always check eBay and see what's out there. I was able to place it to a newspaper article and actually multiple newspaper articles that used the same photograph. So I found the actual picture from the negative that matched. It only says from a Navy plane, because obviously during the war, you wouldn't want to be telling the enemy, so-and-so on such and such ship took this picture on such and such date. But being able to handle the negative and see that it's from a specific aircraft from a specific ship, and then seeing that same picture in newspapers reporting that MacArthur returned to the Philippines was really, really cool. One other aside, there were a few dust-ups, a few instances where Japanese planes rose to fight the men of Fighting 18 in September of 1944, but they tended to pick on the photo pilots, because the photo pilots flew in small divisions. They flew in a four-man team. They broke off from the larger strike, which was composed of dozens of planes. So if you're looking to score easily and then scoot away quickly, you'll probably want to pick on that four-man team. Fortunately for the guys in the photo division, they were very skilled at what they did. Both of the men pictured here, Harvey Picken and then Charlie Mallory to the right, ended the war as double aces. So they both shot down more than 10 enemy aircraft. So it worked out for them ultimately that they were picked on so badly. Things changed dramatically for the squadron in October of 1944. So this anchor here is where they were positioned in September, but things moved very quickly, and actually they got a new fleet anchorage all the way over here at Ulithi Atoll, so 1,400 miles closer to Japan, and all of a sudden they're able to stay out in combat a lot longer and launch strikes a lot more deeply into Japanese territory. The other big change for Intrepid and for the men of Fighting 18 in October was that Intrepid became a flagship. Intrepid was always traveling with other ships, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, those are gunships, and other carriers as well. Admiral Gerald Bogan, who's pictured here, became the group commander for Task Group 38.2, Intrepid's group, on October 1st, 1944. The rest of October was the diametrical opposite of September. The squadron on October 10th participated in strikes on the Ryukyu Islands. These are Japanese home islands. So we're going from the Palaus and the Philippines way south all the way up to knocking on the doorstep of the empire. This is the first strike on October 10th on Japanese territory since the Doolittle raids in 1942. So it's been about 2 years since U.S. carriers have operated this closely to the enemy's home base. And on this one day, 1,396 aircraft are launched from the carriers in Task Force 38. So almost 1,400 planes from these dozens of carriers operating as part of Halsey's Third Fleet. This is a big change, obviously, from the beginning of the war. At this point, the arsenal of democracy has helped the U.S. kind of launch itself way beyond Japan's capabilities, and we're seeing Japanese pilots, Japanese ships, all of that waning rapidly through 1944. The strikes really surprised the Japanese, and ultimately, those strikes on October 10th precipitate the largest air battle during the course of the Pacific War, which takes place over the course of 1 week over Taiwan. You'll see that referred to as Formosa in all of these documents. That's what it was called at the time. And in the course of 1 week, this is a graphic from the Navy's All Hands magazine in December 1944, 565 enemy planes are claimed shot down. Compare that with 376 claimed shot down in the preceding 3+ weeks. So all of a sudden, you're seeing a huge escalation. Japan is unleashing the aerial resources it's kept in reserve up to this point to try to strike back as quickly as possible at the carriers that are loitering off Taiwan. And for Fighting 18, their role, their responsibility is to hit northern Taiwan. All of the names you see here, like Kirun, now we would call that Keelung, a major harbor in northern Taiwan. Shinshiku is Shinshu. These huge air battles are requiring guys who have never seen Japanese planes in the air to suddenly, figure out how to survive when there's 3, 4, 5 enemies constantly flying behind them, in front of them, approaching them from basically all sides. This is Arthur Mollenauer. The guys called him Mo. And he became an ace in a day. He shot down 5 enemy planes and said, I just kept my finger on the gun button and they just kept flying in front of me. There were so many planes that he basically couldn't miss. He did also say, when I was coming back to the ship, it dawned on me what I had just been through and my hands started shaking, right? He was sweating through his flight suit. In the heat of battle, he didn't really recognize it. But when he realized that he was more or less home free, it started to sink in. He wasn't the only one who had this experience. The huge amount of writing on the bottom of these reports is listing aircraft that were destroyed in air combat. And this is just from the morning operation from Intrepid. Over the course of this one day on October 12th, 1944, Fighting 18 claimed 46 enemy planes shot down. So huge amount of air combat, more than they would see for the remainder of their tour of duty and more than really any Intrepid air group would see for the remainder of its service in the war. The flip side of that, of course, is that there are going to be people who are lost when you have a battle this large. And Wesley Keels, this is his division, out of these 4 men that he served with, 2 were lost on that morning sweep alone. 4 members of Fighting 18 were missing in action by the end of October 12th, 1944. And a 5th, his plane was so badly damaged when he bailed out, it hit him, broke his leg in multiple places, and although he survived, his tour of duty was over. Flying planes like this where you're constantly pushing and pulling, this is before fly-by-wire and autopilot, et cetera, you're not going to be able to handle one of these aircraft with a leg broken in multiple places. So that effectively ended his time with the squadron. Now, at the end of this big air battle, you have the largest naval battle in modern history. The battle that I just discussed is not talked about as much in the historical record because it was followed within 2 weeks by the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle by most metrics in history, and certainly in terms of the size of the ships that were involved. This is an aerial shot that was taken October 24th, 1944, at the outbreak of the carrier component of this battle. And the ships that were down below, although they look small in that previous picture, were the largest battleships ever constructed and put to sea. They were called the Yamato class battleships. This is one of them. Those gun turrets, if you look just to the left of them, you'll see some white figures. Those are people on the deck of the ship. There were three triple turrets of this size that could launch a shell that weighed as much as a Volkswagen Beetle over the island of Manhattan. So you're talking about the biggest, baddest battleships that have ever been constructed. And they're heading straight towards Leyte, where MacArthur's troops are just beginning to make progress, and they pose a major threat to the landing operation. At this time, October 24th, 1944, due to a number of circumstances I don't have time to go into here, Intrepid is really the only big carrier in the way of Japan's biggest battleship force that's going to participate in this historic battle. I do have to shout out a Wilmingtonian at this point. The men who are responsible for finding this big group of Japanese battleships, the guy who's actually on the radar console of one of these aircraft, Cornelius Clark, is pictured here. He's sitting on a stoop on West 29th Street in Wilmington. If you Google Maps the home address, it looks very much the same, the stoop that he's sitting on now. So he was the one who first on radar said, whoa, there's something really big out there. He was in dive bombing Squadron 18. The guys from Fighting 18, who I wrote a little bit more about, who are in the search sector that discovered the major Japanese battleships, are pictured here. Paul Ammerman on the left, and Lieutenant Don Watts, his section leader, on his right. And they sent a very important report to Admiral Halsey way out east on the other side of the Philippines, saying, the ships are coming. There's no carriers with them at this point. There's no transports. This is not an operation to land troops to fight General MacArthur. This is a surface force that's coming to try to sink our ships. In the top left, 4BB is battleships, 8CA is heavy cruisers, and 13DD is destroyers. This is off by one. There were 5 battleships and 7 heavy cruisers, but was pretty remarkably close when you're flying within gun range, but still pretty high up above these ships, circling and trying desperately to get this information to the people who can call the shots and launch a big strike. I am happy to say, and one of the most important parts, I think, of my book project is that a lot of these artifacts are now in the collection of the Intrepid Museum and telling this story on site. The museum sees about 1 million visitors a year, more than are going to, read my book. So having this stuff go there, this is the hangar deck level where a lot of the historical exhibitions are, to tell the story of Intrepid during World War II is really meaningful to me. And actually, Don Watts, who was the guy responsible for sending that important transmission to Admiral Halsey, his flight logbook is now on display permanently as part of this exhibition, which has been a really neat part of this process. So at the end of October, a new phase of the war begins, the kamikaze phase of World War II. Intrepid is actually hit October 29th. A glancing blow. It kills 10 men who are in a gun tub on the port side of the ship, but Intrepid can continue fighting at least through November. But on November 25th, 1944, that all changes. The men of Fighting 18 are largely in the air on combat air patrol, trying to protect the ship, or on strike operations, trying to destroy kamikaze aircraft on the ground. But around noon, 2 planes get through combat air patrol, they get by the ship's guns, and they crash through Intrepid's flight deck. These are wood decks, so they're going to crash through into the hangar deck where planes are loaded with fuel, ordnance, and all that, explode in devastating effect. This is the worst day in Intrepid's history. 69 officers and enlisted men are killed in this attack, including one enlisted man from Fighting Squadron 18. A lot more would have perished if not for orders that had come down earlier in the month. That during general quarters, the alarm that something bad could happen, they were supposed to hunker down under the armored hangar deck of the ship. So fortunately, more of those guys survived than otherwise would have. I talk about this pretty extensively in the book, both in the beginning and the end. For Fighting 18, the story I found most compelling is the guy at left here. He's the air combat intelligence officer for the squadron. He's basically, he was a lawyer, Princeton educated. He's examining the pilots when they come back from strikes, listening to their stories and trying to corroborate them with gun camera footage to look at them relative to one another and see who's saying they did, who's saying who did what. He was in the gallery deck, one of the unprotected spaces when the kamikazes hit. And the first kamikaze basically blew his shirt off his body and burned him pretty badly, but he was able to get out of there, seek medical help, and ultimately survived the attack. A lot of the squadron's documents did not. And that's one of many reasons I think Fighting 18 hasn't been kind of written about as much, is that doing the legwork to track down the information was complicated by the fact that so much of this perished in the fires aboard Intrepid. This is actually one of the original logbooks that was in the collection of Paul Ammerman. You can see the state that it was left in by the kamikaze fires. It had to go out for special conservation treatment before it could find its permanent home at the Intrepid Museum. And it's very difficult to read. A lot of these guys had to remake their logbooks from a master list. The kamikaze strike ended Fighting 18's tenure aboard Intrepid. But it's important to note, by this time they had really become part of the ship. The ship's crew recognized them as, among their own and stood up for them. And the opposite was true as well. This is a photo I showed earlier before Fighting 18 came aboard Intrepid with the rising sun flags up above their head. That's the ship's scorecard for enemy planes shot down, the ship silhouettes, enemy ships damaged. So this is circa February, March 1944. When Fighting 18 leaves Intrepid in November 1944, the scorecard looks like this. It's basically full. It's been extended to be able to accommodate all of the enemy planes they've destroyed, all the enemy ships they've helped to sink or damage, along with the dive bomber and torpedo squadrons. So they've been through a lot together. And that's why it was so difficult for these guys when at the end of the month they were told basically, Fighting 18, Intrepid's out of commission. It needs to go back for major repairs. We're going to send dive bombing and torpedo 18 back. You have to stay. The kamikaze is still too much of a threat. We need as many fighter pilots here as we can get. Even though you're tired, you've been through hell at this point, we need to keep you here just in case. The dive bombing and torpedo squadrons throw Fighting 18 a big party. They basically clear out whatever liquor ration they had and send them off the ship the next day on rubber legs and with pounding headaches. They go to Ulithi, they're assigned to another ship, and Intrepid goes home without them. Now, fortunately, common sense prevails. They're sent home and arrive back in the States right around New Year's Eve, 1945. And then by the time they're done training for their second combat deployment, the war comes to an end. So they dodge having to go through all of this over again. In the course of doing this research and speaking with these families and looking through their archives, one thing that really struck me towards the end of the book project in particular is how many families' collections speak to one another. At the beginning, when I only knew one or two families related to the squadron, I was seeing points of view of individuals. As I met dozens of squadron families, I began to notice that I could share information across families to say, oh, here's a piece of your story that is in the collection of another family. It's a letter that your grandfather or your uncle wrote. In the case of these two photographs, it's a letter from the fiance of Bill Ziemer, one of the members of the squadron who was shot down over Taiwan, to Wally Walworth, saying, I hope he's okay. In 1944, were you there? Can you tell me any more? There's another letter from 1945 that I talk about in the book as well. And then there's photos on the right-hand side that were in the collection of Bill Ziemer's family. And actually, happy birthday to Howard. He just turned 102. I was on a Zoom call with him and his family earlier. So one of the guys I wrote about, his brother, two of his brothers are still with us at 102 and 97 and a half. the other pictures are Francis Layton, who wrote the letter at the left, going out to the Zemer family, meeting them and taking photos with them to document her experience. So I was able to share the photos of Francis Layton with the Walworth family, who had the letter but hadn't seen her, and then the letter with the Zemer family, who had met her but had not seen what she had written to one of his squadron mates. I've been to family reunions, the Keels family reunion down in North Carolina. Um, oops. And then I've also actually met Squadron family members aboard Intrepid. This is the 80th commissioning anniversary of the ship. Brian O'Malley presenting me with his father's survival scarf, map of the Philippines in silk. And I've helped, like I said, shepherd artifacts to the museum as well. This is the Ammerman family, multiple generations, looking through his materials before I was able to give them a tour of the ship. So I guess in conclusion, I really wrote this book because there's all these different stories out there. Everyone's family has a story, but it's something else to say there's a connection between point A and point B with your family's story and another family's story. And if I am the caretaker of all of that, there's kind of a responsibility incumbent upon me to bring those connections forward and to tell more people about them, about the sacrifice these men gave to their country during World War II. So without any further droning on about the book, I'd be happy to take questions at this point. If you want to shout them out, I'll just repeat them into the mic, and that way the people on Zoom can hear them. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, when Intrepid was damaged by the kamikazes and the pilots weren't able to come back to the ship, where did they land? So some of them landed at Tacloban on Leyte, which was still under active attack by the Japanese. So those are pretty interesting stories. The rest of them landed on various other carriers that were parts either of Intrepid's task group or of other nearby task groups. So Ticonderoga was a big one. I think 13 or so planes from Fighting 18 wound up going there at that point. So they went wherever they could, but yeah, Intrepid was a no-go at that point. Do you think their extended training sessions for team how well they did see battle? Yeah, so the question was the extended training session in Hawaii, did that contribute to the squadron's success when they actually were deployed? Yes, I think that was definitely the case. In the book, I talk a little bit about Cecil Harris, being a teacher. So having a background in pedagogy, being able to talk about what he had learned and his experience and to pass that information to a squadron that hadn't dealt with it firsthand. So I think being in Hawaii for longer certainly couldn't have hurt. And I also think it gave the squadron more familiarity with the Hellcat. So the aircraft they were flying at this point was the F-6F Hellcat. They were flying the latest model, the Dash 5, which had water injection. It had combat flaps, so springs in the flaps to make it more maneuverable. All the bells and whistles. So the more opportunity you have to familiarize yourself with that plane you'll be flying in combat, the better it is for you, for sure. Yeah, so the question was, are there still stories out there that I only have an incomplete picture of, or are there members of the squadron maybe I don't know anything about? Definitely. So there's about 65 original members of Fighting 18. When I was furloughed during COVID temporarily, I made a lot of cold calls. I have had some folks reach out to me as the project developed over social media to help say, hey, I recognize that squadron. I am the son or daughter of so and so, and I'd be happy to tell you more. But there are still, I would say, probably between 6 and 10 members of the squadron where I know very little. And I think even though the book is published, I definitely want to keep pulling on the loose threads. It's a bit of a compulsion. But at this point, I feel like I probably should. So we'll see where it goes from here. I still do blogs and things like that. So I still try to post whatever I find more recently online to expand on what's in the book.
So what's your next project?
What's my next project? I'll probably take a short break, a breather, because I wrote this book while I was working a 9 to 5 principally, which was unwise. Um, so I would probably have to go on sabbatical. Uh, I would be interested in a more zoomed out picture of Intrepid's history. So the history of Intrepid's aviators, not just during World War II, but across all the way through 1974. That's when the ship was decommissioned. So you still had fighter pilots, you had pilots flying attack aircraft that were evolving constantly through 1974, from piston-powered aircraft to jets, from World War II to Vietnam to anti-submarine warfare during the Cold War. I think it would be interesting to try to continue this cockpit perspective of what are the guys experiencing, what are their stories, where did they come from, and how does it relate to the larger context of the wars they participated in. But that'll be down the line, I think. I'll give myself a breather, and then we'll see how I'm feeling when I have more energy. Yeah.
It sounds like you got this job kind of by accident. Did you have a prior interest in World War II history, military history, or did you just stumble into this and then your curiosity got going?
So the question was, based on I have a BA in history. I wound up at the museum, and then sort of through, was it through serendipity, or how ultimately did I get where I am? Um, yeah, I would say I fell into it somewhat. My background at the University of Delaware is in labor and literary history, which are still passions of mine. I'm still very interested in. So it's very exciting about the Walt Whitman celebration that's occurring. Um, Being on site at Intrepid is what spurred that interest in World War II history, both practically as a way to get into the field and do history. Knowing what was there on site would help me, but also as I learned more about the history, I think if you study any historical subject, you'll find something there that speaks to you, whether it's a person, in my case, Cecil Harris, who was quiet and reserved, but doing this very heroic, very dangerous thing, earning accolades, but telling everyone, no, talk to these other guys. I don't want to deal with it, basically. There's some kind of mystery or some kind of reverberation, that you'll feel from any subject, even if you don't have a familiarity or even maybe an interest at the beginning. So yes, very much serendipity. Yeah. So the question was, where was Intrepid taken after that really bad kamikaze attack? And how long did it take to repair the ship? So Intrepid went to Hunters Point, California. That was the major place where these repairs were affected. And actually, Intrepid was out fighting again by February of 45. So these kamikaze attacks happened at the end of November 1944. And within the span of a few months, the ship was back out in the Pacific fighting again. The damage control aboard these carriers, the Essex-class carriers, was excellent. And although many of them were damaged, some of them even worse than Intrepid, none of them were sunk. So there were 24 ships of this class produced by the end of World War II, and they all survived. There are 4 Essex-class carrier museums around today, one in Charleston, South Carolina, Corpus Christi, Texas, Alameda, California, and Intrepid in New York City at 46th and 12th. And if you want to go up at any point, I'm your neighbor. Let me know if I'm going to be on site or something. I'll show you around. Yeah, so the question was, the Corsair aircraft was known to have issues landing aboard carriers, and what was the deal with that? Actually, that relates to why this squadron, which flew, Fighting 18 flew the Hellcat, why they were attached to Intrepid. Early on, the design of the Corsair is really hard to see over the nose. They had to completely redesign the canopy. They had to change the shocks and struts and things that were used for landing aboard, because they were like basically flatting their tires every time they came back aboard the ships. That was the early Corsair design, and ultimately it went through some different iterations and was improved upon. In those early days, There was a squadron, Fighting Squadron 17, the Jolly Rogers. They're pretty famous now. They were going to be aboard the Bunker Hill for their deployment in late 1943. The Navy said, the Corsair is not working right now. You're going to go serve aboard a land base, and we're going to put another squadron in your place in Air Group 17. That was a squadron called Fighting Squadron 18, not the one I wrote about, not related at all to the Fighting Squadron 18 you just heard about, a completely different unit to make things very complicated. So there were two Fighting Squadron 18s that were designated by the Navy. One of them sort of ceased to exist in early 1944. The Navy just quietly dissolved it and sent the aviators to different commands. That left a hole when Air Group 18 lost its fighting squadron. That left a hole that Fighting 36, which became the second Fighting Squadron 18, ultimately filled in the summer of 1944. So there were teething issues with the Corsair early on. By the time Corsairs like the FG-1D, the Corsair that's on display at the Intrepid Museum, came out, a lot of those issues had been ironed out, and the Corsair became almost the preferred platform for ships like Intrepid.
Intrepid was taken out of service, due to the damage and so forth. And its pilots were spread around. When the Intrepid came back into service, did they get those pilots back?
So the question was, when Intrepid was seriously damaged, the pilots were taken off, and then the ship went back into service, went back to fight in 45. Did they come back aboard? So the way the Navy organized its ships and its air groups, they weren't wedded or joined at the hip. So air groups would basically be attached almost as plug and play options to the ships as the Navy needed. So a completely different air group actually went aboard Intrepid in 45, while Air Group 18 went back through a second round of training. After your combat deployment to rescue, to get new men in to replace the men who were lost, they would have close to another year of training. So Fighting 18 and the rest of the air group went through almost a year of training in 1945. The war came to a close. And then Fighting 18 participated in Navy Day, October of 45, by doing simulated attacks on New Orleans, which I'm sure was interesting for both the people in New Orleans. Yeah, it was a big sort of show. The Ranger, the ship they were attached to at the time, went into the Gulf, and the guys flew off and basically did a big show of strength in October of 45 in celebration of the end of the war, end of Navy Day. So to answer your question, basically, whenever these ships were damaged and then went back into service, or even at the end of their deployments, they would bring a fresh air group on, a separate men entirely. Yep.
Different, but I'm interested in your research, and I might know the answer to this had I read your book, so forgive me, I didn't get to it.
It's okay.
Yet. But I'm wondering about your interviews with the family. Did you have a standard interview questionnaire, or did you talk to them differently depending on who their family member was in the squadron? How did that research work?
So the question was, for interviewing squadron family members, did I have a standard operating procedure or practice, or what did I do sort of contextually when I was speaking with them? I would say it was more the latter. In terms of oral history interviews with aviators themselves, I conducted one with Chuck DeMoss, who was a member of Fighting 18, and one with Larry Donahue, who was an officer. He was a non-flying officer in the squadron who was responsible for engineering and maintenance of the aircraft. For those, which I conducted for and with the Intrepid Museum, it was a little bit more standardized. I was part of the oral history committee at the museum earlier when I was a tour guide, and we got a little bit of training for the kinds of questions to ask and the way to pose them. So as opposed to jumping in and kind of telling someone yes or no, or framing it a certain way, letting them kind of tell the story and helping to connect the pieces of the puzzle. For the siblings that I interviewed, like Orrin and Lily Keels or Howard Zemer, it was much more sort of free-flowing and based on what I knew about their siblings. So for Orrin and Lily, I asked more about what it was like growing up, since they were sharecroppers, and that was such a unique story relative to a lot of the other members of the squadron. Whereas for Howard, I knew he came from a big Navy family. All five of the brothers went into the Navy, and their father was in the Navy as well. I leaned the questions a little bit that way. So I think by and large for the family members, it was more questions based on what I knew and things I didn't know, filling in some of the gaps and why was that the case? Why were you a Navy family? Or, you know, when did you guys get telephone lines, you know, on the farm in North Carolina? Because they said basically they didn't have them growing up. So, yep. Awesome. Well, if there are no further questions, I'd be happy to sign books, sell books, speak to you further in the back. Thanks for everyone watching on Zoom. If you haven't already supported the Scholars Guild, please consider doing so because they host a lot of great folks. And if you're local, come out to more of the talks. But yeah, thanks for having me and thanks for sticking around.
Refreshments in here, we have time to mingle, you have time to come up and chat with Mike or ask him other questions. I also was remiss in not thanking enough people. I always thank Chris Day for setting things up. I want to thank David Reese for bringing the refreshments and Jennifer Border for helping us get on Zoom. I think that we did. And Kathleen, of course, for introducing. Thank you.
Excellent. Very good. I have to head out, but I'll be back. Hey, gang. That's just, you know,